The logistics floor at Zenith Global was once a silent cathedral built upon the foundations of absolute mathematical certainty and the tireless pursuit of optimized flow. My name is Leo, and for 12 years, I served as the senior architect of global distribution, a role that required me to live within the subtextual spaces of supply chain algorithms and the cold, unblinking data of international freight movements. Our office was a masterpiece of focused, unadorned productivity, a place where the air was thick not with a scent of performative social energy, but with a quiet, industrious hum of high-end workstations and the rhythmic, percussive tapping of mechanical keyboards that echoed like the heartbeat of a massive, well-oiled machine. In this world, merit was the only currency that carried any weight. Your value was determined by your uptime, your ability to predict a port strike 3 weeks in advance, and the elegance of the scripts you wrote to automate the impossible. We were a team of 50 specialists, men and women who shared a deep, unspoken bond forged in the fires of Q4 surges and the shared exhilaration of a perfectly executed logistics pivot. We didn't need culture huddles or vulnerability workshops because we shared the most profound intimacy available in the professional world. The knowledge that every person in the room was a master of their craft. I was a compliance ghost of the department, a man who occupied his cubicle with the stillness of a predator and precision of a watchmaker, ensuring that the global grid remained green, while remaining virtually invisible to the higher-level administrative fluff that occasionally drifted through the hallways. To my colleagues, my silence was a mark of deep focus, a signal that the architecture was sound and the systems were stable. It was an unforced, organic form of respect that required no mission statement to sustain. However, the world of Zenith was about to be forcibly realigned by the arrival of the conglomerate's new board of directors, and with them came Clara, the woman who would become the high priestess of our department's destruction. Clara was a newly appointed vice president of social sustainability and human equity, a woman who didn't just walk into a room, but colonized with a cloud of expensive, avant-garde minimalist wool and a dialect of corporate sociolinguistics that felt like being hit in the face with a textbook on radical deconstruction. She saw our quiet sanctuary not as a model of efficiency, but as a toxic, unexamined vacuum of masculine silence that needed to be aggressively dismantled to make room for a vocalized, equitable landscape. She spent her first week at the firm not studying our distribution maps or our technical bottlenecks, but patrolling the aisles with a sleek, charcoal-gray tablet, recording the spatial occupancy of our desks and the linguistic dominance of our informal huddles, treating our decade of professional brotherhood as a collection of problematic variables that needed to be debugged and purged. Clara's formal introduction to the department arrived on a rainy Monday morning in the form of a mandatory linguistic alignment and atmospheric equity meeting, a session that was not intended for collaboration, but for the declaration of a new ideological regime. We gathered in the main conference hall, a space that Clara had already stripped of its technical awards and historical photos, replacing them with vibrant, aggressive banners detailing the architecture of the unspoken and reclaiming the narrative space. She stood at the head of the room, her chin tilted at an angle of practiced authority, her eyes scanning the team with the cold, diagnostic pity of a doctor looking at a terminal patient. Zenith Global has been operating as a monocultural fossil, Clara declared, her voice a smooth, academic blade that seemed to sever the connections between us as she spoke. You see logistics. I see a reinforced structure of exclusionary silence that suppresses the marginalized voice before it can even form conceptual thought. You see data. I see a weaponized form of male-centric logic used to gatekeep the creative agency of this firm. She tapped her tablet, and the massive 8K screen behind her displayed the Zenith Equity Mandate, a set of rules that felt like they were written for a re-education camp rather than a logistics firm. Rule 1 was a linguistic quota, which strictly forbade any man from speaking in a meeting until at least 3 women had provided substantive emotional and conceptual input. Rule 2 was a technical deference buffer, a mandatory 5-second silence that every man had to observe after a woman finished speaking to prevent the aggressive crowding of the creative thought space. But Rule 3 was the true killing blow, the tone sensitivity audit, which required all internal communications sent by men to be run through an AI-based empathy filter to ensure they weren't being assertively brief or task-oriented to the point of erasure. I sat there, watching my colleagues, brilliant men and women who had built this company, exchange looks of total, hollow disbelief. I looked at Sarah, our lead analyst, expecting her to challenge the absurdity of a 5-second buffer during a live shipping crisis. But she saw the HR representatives standing in the back of the room with their tablets open, and she looked down at her hands. Clara locked eyes with me. Her expression won a predatory satisfaction. She had already identified me as the primary target for her cultural restoration, the quiet man whose very competence was, in her mind, the ultimate form of toxic gatekeeping. She wanted to struggle, she wanted to fight, and she wanted me to provide the patriarchal pushback that would give her the excuse to categorize me as an obstacle to progress. I simply looked at my watch, waited for the mandatory 5-second buffer to pass after she finished her proclamation, and then stood up in silence, nodding once with the cold, mechanical precision of a man who had just integrated a new set of system constraints into his operating parameters. I walked back to my desk and opened a blank document, realizing that the logistics of Zenith Global were no longer my concern. The only project that mattered now was the absolute, perfect, and eventually destructive compliance with the rules Clara had written to govern our ruins. The transition from a high-performance meritocracy to a sterile laboratory of sociological experimentation happened with a speed that was as breathtaking as it was destructive, as the office of Zenith Global began to resemble a museum of living statues rather than a hub of international commerce. In the weeks following the declaration of the Zenith Equity Mandate, the physical and psychological landscape of our department was meticulously terraformed by Clara's ideological requirements, creating a world where every movement was calculated and every word was a potential liability. The most immediate and jarring change was the implementation of the digital equity timer, a sleek, pulsing ore placed in the center of every conference table that glowed a soft, approving green when a woman was speaking and turned an angry, accusatory crimson if a man dared to exceed his allotted linguistic footprint. I watched as my colleagues, men who had spent their entire lives solving the most complex puzzles of global trade, became biological mirrors of this technology, their faces hardening into masks of absolute, unblinking neutrality as they mastered the art of the 5-second deference buffer. It was a surreal sight to witness a room full of senior architects sitting in total silence, staring at a ticking digital clock after Sarah or Elena had finished a sentence, terrified that speaking too soon would be categorized by Clara as a spatial intrusion or an act of conceptual crowding. This wasn't just a change in etiquette. It was a total lobotomy of the company's collective intuition, as a rapid-fire exchange of ideas that had once kept the global grid stable was replaced by a slow, clunky, and entirely performative ritual of permission-seeking. Clara sat in the corner of these meetings, her charcoal-gray tablet glowing as she recorded our compliance resonance, her eyes searching for a flicker of resentment or a stray toxic sigh that she could use to justify another calibration workshop. But she found nothing but a void. We had realized that the only way to survive was to become the ghosts she claimed we were, withdrawing our energy, our passion, and our unearned logic so completely that the very air of the room felt stagnant. The women in the department, who were supposed to feel liberated by this sudden vacuum, instead looked like they were being crushed by the weight of having performed 100% of the conceptual heavy lifting, while their most experienced partners sat motionless, bound by the very rules Clara had written to empower them. I remember a specific meeting regarding a bottleneck in the Singapore Straits where Sarah looked at me, her eyes screaming for the technical solution she knew I had tucked away in my head. But I simply looked at the digital equity timer, waited for the 5-second buffer pass, and then stated that I was holding space for her creative journey. The look of pure, hollow exhaustion on her face was a testament to the fact that you cannot build a team by silencing half of its members. But Clara merely logged the moment as a successful reclamation of the narrative stage, oblivious to the fact that the company's heart was beginning to skip beats. The tone sensitivity audit became the second pillar of our collective disconnection, a digital panopticon that effectively severed the last remaining threads of human connection between the men and women of Zenith Global. Every email, Slack message, and internal memo sent by a male employee was now automatically rerouted through a linguistic empathy filter. An AI-driven script Clara had commissioned to flag what she called assertive imperatives and task-oriented erasure. In this new linguistic regime, a man could no longer send a message as simple as "the report is late. We need it by 5 p.m." As such, brevity was now classified as a hostile administrative demand that ignored the emotional labor of the recipient. To avoid the inevitable calibration summon to Clara's office, we adopted a style of communication I began called Blandbot, a stripped-down, hyper-formalized dialect that was as efficient as code, but as cold as an ice flow. My emails became exercises in linguistic gymnastics, prefaced with mandatory acknowledgments of creative agency and atmospheric safety that turned a 10-word request into a 3-paragraph diplomatic treaty. The result was a total breakdown of high-bandwidth communication. Technical issues that used to be solved in seconds via a quick Slack message now required hours of careful drafting and AI vetting, leading to a mounting pile of unresolved technical debt that Clara chose to ignore in favor of her atmospheric audits. She would frequently pull men aside to interrogate their subtext, asking Tom or Javier why they hadn't used more connective empathy language in a discussion about server cooling, or why their digital presence felt unnecessarily dense. In response, the men stopped talking entirely. The break room, which had once been a place of lively debate and laughter, became a silent transition zone where men and women moved past each other like strangers in terminal, avoiding eye contact to prevent any gaze-based microaggressions. We severed our social bonds, deleted our fantasy football leagues, and canceled our Friday afternoon drinks, realizing that any form of male bonding was now evidence of an exclusionary patriarchal cluster. Clara saw this isolation as a victory, a sign that she had successfully deconstructed the informal power structures of the office, but she failed to realize that those power structures were the very things that held the company together during a crisis. We were no longer a team of architects. We were a collection of isolated nodes, each following a set of logic gates that prioritized vibrational resonance over the actual delivery of freight. I spent my afternoon sitting in my cubicle, watching the global maps turn from a healthy green to a cautionary yellow, and for the first time in my career, I felt absolutely nothing. If the system wanted to fail, I was perfectly compliant in its failure, as long as my tone remained within the acceptable parameters of Clara's filter. The breaking point for the company's operational integrity and the final verification of compliance ghost strategy arrived during the Arctic Corridor crisis, a logistical nightmare involving 3 stranded icebreakers and a $50 million cargo of sensitive medical supplies that required a total, synchronized effort from every senior architect in the firm. Under the old regime, this would have been a war room event, a high-stakes, caffeine-fueled 48-hour push where voices would overlap, desks would be covered in maps, and I would have been at the center of the storm, calling out adjustments in real time to navigate the cascading delays. But this was the era of atmospheric equity, and the war room had been converted into the resonant sanctuary, a space filled with floor cushions and non-hierarchical white boards where no one was allowed to raise their voice or provide unsolicited technical corrections. Clara led the crisis huddle, her charcoal tablet glowing as she directed Sarah and Elena to conceptualize a pathway through the crisis that prioritized collective wellness over the frantic urgency of the old guard. Sarah, who was a brilliant analyst but had no experience with Arctic tide patterns, was visibly panicking as she stared at a screen showing the ships drifting closer to the permafrost, her eyes constantly darting toward me for a solution I could have provided in 5 seconds. I sat on a low, backless stool, my hands folded in my lap, following Rule 1, Rule 2, and Rule 3 with the religious intensity of a zealot, waiting through the mandatory 5-second buffer after every one of Sarah's frantic, incorrect suggestions. When the time finally came for me to speak, I didn't offer a fix. I offered supportive listening, reciting the mandatory preambles about valuing the creative journey, while the ships remained stuck in the ice. I valued perspective you brought to the tide mapping, Sarah. I said, my voice is monotone as a pre-recorded announcement, and I want to hold space for the anxiety this crisis is causing you. However, as the protocol mandates that I do not usurp the intellectual agency of the female lead. I will wait for you to propose a corrective script before I integrate the data." Clara beamed at me, her head nodding in approval at my growth, while Sarah nearly threw her laptop across the room in a fit of hysterical frustration. The medical supplies were lost to the cold. The client sued Zenith Global for the full value of the cargo, and the firm's stock price underwent a catastrophic correction that wiped out 3 years of growth in a single afternoon. Clara's report to the board of directors didn't mention the technical failure or the millions lost. It focused entirely on the unprecedented level of linguistic equity achieved during the crisis, claiming that the men had finally receded from the conceptual stage to allow female voices to lead through failure. She had truly destroyed my career, as I was now seen by the higher-ups as a passive, useless drone. But I didn't care. I had seen the look on the CEO's face when he saw the Resonance Sanctuary report, and I knew that Clara's kingdom was built on sand. I packed my single cardboard box that night, signed my voluntary separation agreement with a neutral smile, and walked out of the building without saying a word to a single person, leaving Clara alone in a silent office with a $50 million hole in the budget and a room full of men who had finally, perfectly, stopped caring if she survived the night. The year following my departure from Zenith Global was not a period of lamentation or professional mourning, but rather a surgical extraction of my spirit from a dying organism and its subsequent transplantation into a far more vibrant, logic-driven ecosystem that the industry would soon come to know as Nexus Prime. When I walked out of those double glass doors of Final Time, leaving behind the oatmeal-colored carpet and the pulsing red glow of the digital equity timers, I felt a sense of lightness that was almost biological, as if the heavy shroud of Clara's ideological surveillance had been physically lifted from my shoulders. The market, unlike the resonant sanctuary of Zenith Global, remains a cold, unblinking arbor of reality. It does not care about vibrational alignment or the linguistic footprint of a distribution architect. It only cares about the speed of light, the integrity of the chain, and the absolute elimination of friction. In the weeks after my voluntary separation, I didn't reach out to recruiters or browse LinkedIn for another cubicle to inhabit. Instead, I retreated to a private office in a brutalist concrete building on the edge of the industrial district, a space that smelled of ozone and fresh solder rather than essential oils and performative empathy. There, I spent 20 hours a day building a prototype for what would become the Nexus Logic Core, a logistics engine that utilized the very things Clara had tried to purge: directness, aggressive optimization, and a total lack of atmospheric negotiation as its primary operating principles. I realized that the compliance ghost strategy one had practiced at Zenith wasn't just a survival mechanism. It was a form of research, a high-level study in how systems fail when they prioritize feelings over flow. My new venture began to attract the very clients Zenith had driven away with its decolonize delay tactics. Global shipping titans who had been mocked by Clara for their masculine urgency found in Nexus Prime a partner that spoke the only language that mattered, the language of the green screen and the zero-latency pivot. While Clara was busy writing academic papers about the unprecedented equity of the Arctic corridor disaster, I was busy hiring the blandbots and ghosts who had also fled Zenith, men and women whose brilliance had been categorized as a systemic burden, and who were now hungry to work in a world where the only calibration was a code review. We built a culture that was the antithesis of sanctuary, a loud, messy, intellectually violent meritocracy where a 5-second silence was considered a catastrophic system error, and where the only safe space was a correctly mapped supply chain. By the 6-month mark, Nexus Prime wasn't just a competitor. It was a predator, systematically devouring Zenith's market share as the firm's operational integrity continued to dissolve under Clara's atmospheric audits. I watched from my high-rise office, a space filled with massive, imposing monitors and a silence born of deep concentration rather than mandated fear, as Zenith Global stock price entered a terminal velocity decline, realizing that the passive drone Clara thought she had destroyed was actually the only person who knew how to stop the company from vibrating itself into a pile of expensive, asymmetrical dust. While my new world was being built upon the foundations of absolute technical certainty, The world I left behind at Zenith Global had descended into a state of decadent, ideological rot that Clara mistook for a harmonic peak. The office had become a place of pure theater, where the actual movement of freight was secondary to the vocalized reclamation of agency that Clara demanded in her 3-hour-long morning resonance huddles. With the departure of the senior architects, the men who had actually understood the Byzantine clockwork of the global distribution grid, the department was left in the hands of panders and blandbots, individuals who were more skilled at reciting Clara's sociological jargon than they were at solving a routing error. Sarah and Elena, the women Clara claimed to be empowering, were the first to truly suffer. They were drowning in the sheer volume of conceptual heavy lifting because the men around them had become so terrified of intellectual undermining that they refused to offer even a basic correction when a database was about to crash. The Arctic corridor crisis hadn't been an anomaly. It was a new baseline. Zenith Global was no longer a logistics firm. It was an expensive, slow-motion experiment in how to kill a company with kindness and equitable thought space. Every time a major client threatened to leave, Clara would respond with an atmospheric impact report, detailing how the firm's commitment to social sustainability was a more valuable asset than a 99% uptime, a delusion that the board of directors actually entertained until the bank accounts began to empty. The silence in the office was now absolute, but it wasn't the silence of focus. It was the silence of a tomb where everyone was waiting for someone else to take the blame for the next failure. Clara sat in the VP's office, the velvet inquisitor of a crumbling kingdom, seemingly oblivious of the fact that the very walls were being sold off to cover the mounting lawsuits from stranded shipping partners. She had created a world where she was the ultimate authority, the queen of a sanctuary where no man dared to speak. But she failed to realize that an office without friction is an office without traction. By the end of the year, the board of directors, faced with a hostile takeover bid from a mystery conglomerate, finally underwent a calibration of their own. They realized that while Clara's equity mandate looked great in a social responsibility brochure, it was a death sentence in a high-speed market. The news of the acquisition hit the office like a shockwave, but Clara remained defiant, convinced that the new owners, a group called the Alpha Nexus Fund, were coming to Zenith because they wanted to scale her equity protocol across their entire portfolio. She spent the final weekend preparing a 200-page presentation on decolonizing the acquisition process, unaware that the man who had authorized the buyout was currently sitting in a brutalist office 5 blocks away, looking at her personnel file with a neutral, compliant expression that concealed a cold, surgical intent to finally finish the deconstruction she had started. The day of the new leadership integration was treated by Clara as a coronation ceremony, a moment where her years of systemic recalibration would finally be recognized by the new global masters of industry. She had ordered the entire staff to gather in the resonant sanctuary, which she had freshly decorated with banners that read Nexus of Equity, a shared vantage, and she insisted that everyone sit on floor cushions to show the new CEO that Zenith was a place where hierarchy had been successfully dissolved. Clara stood at the head of the room, her asymmetrical gray wool suit perfectly pressed, her charcoal tablet held like a holy relic as she waited for the elevator to open and reveal the man who had spent $40 million to save the firm from bankruptcy. She expected a man like the previous a soft, apologetic ally who would nod her jargon and sign her checks without question. But when the elevator doors finally slid open, the sound was not the soft chime of a new era, but the heavy, industrial thud of reality reasserting itself. The man who walked out was flanked by 2 senior analysts I had hired from Zenith 6 months prior, men who had once been compliance ghosts and who were now wearing sharp, tailored suits and carrying the confident, toxic energy of people who knew how to run a business. But Clara didn't look at them. Her eyes were locked on the man in the center, a figure who occupied the space with a stillness that was both terrifying and familiar. I walked into the sanctuary room, not with tablet or floor cushion, but with a physical folder containing the first operational integrity audit of the new regime. I didn't wait for a contextual validation statement, and I didn't observe a 5-second buffer. I walked straight to the center of the room, where the massive executive chair, the boss's chair, had been moved to make room for Clara's cushions. I didn't say a word as I gestured for my team to place the chair back in its original position at the head of the table. The silence in the room was no longer Clara's equitable stillness. It was a deafening, bone-chilling silence, a room full of people who had just seen a ghost return as a king. Clara's face underwent a transformation that I can only describe as a total digital-to-analog breakdown. Her pupils dilated until her eyes were nearly black. Her jaw dropped in a way that suggested a mechanical failure, and the tablet in her hands began to shake with frantic, rhythmic intensity. She looked at me, the man she categorized as a passive drone, the man whose career she thought she had buried under a mountain of atmospheric audits, and she saw me sit down in a chair that now belonged to the CEO of Nexus Global. I looked at my watch, waited for exactly 1 second, and then looked Clara straight in the eyes with the same neutral, compliant expression I had used a year ago. "I value the preparation you put into this huddle, Clara," I said, my voice a low, steady rumble that seemed to vibrate the very floor cushion she was standing on, "and I want to hold space for the shock you're currently experiencing. However, according to new Nexus logic protocol, your presence in this firm has been identified as a systemic friction point that no longer aligns with our uptime requirements. You have exactly 10 minutes to vacate this narrative space before my security team initiates a physical recalibration of your occupancy." The look on her face wasn't just anger. It was the sound of a worldview shattering in a vacuum. The 10 minutes that followed my proclamation were not characterized by the frantic, chaotic energy of a typical corporate firing, but rather by the slow, inevitable grinding of a high-precision machine returning to its original factory settings. I sat in the executive chair at the head of the long mahogany table, a piece of furniture that had been pushed into a dusty corner to make room for Clara's equitable floor cushion geometry, and I watched as the 2 security officers I had brought from Nexus Prime began the physical deconstruction of the resonant sanctuary. It was a cold, surgical process. They didn't shout or push. They simply picked up the bean bags and the soft-texture, modular seating units and moved them toward the service elevator with the rhythmic efficiency of dock workers. Every atmospheric equity banner that Clara had hung from the ceiling was unceremoniously unhooked, the bright, abstract watercolors depicting vibrational flow being rolled up like discarded wallpaper and placed in a bin marked for industrial recycling. The most satisfying moment of the purge, however, was the removal of the digital equity timers, those pulsing, judgmental orbs that had dictated the linguistic footprint of every man in the building for 365 days. My lead technician, a man Clara had once labeled a task-oriented eraser for his habit of fixing servers without first facilitating a vulnerability huddle, walked from desk to desk with a pair of heavy-duty wire cutters. Each time the blade snapped through the power cables of a timer, the pulsing green or red light died instantly, leaving behind only a hollow plastic shell and profound, ringing silence that felt like the return of a long-lost friend. I didn't look at Clara while this was happening. I kept my eyes on my laptop, opening the primary administrative terminal for Zenith's central distribution server. I was busy revoking her root-level access to the linguistic empty filter, a script I found running on the main mail server that was currently hogging 40% of the CPU cycles just to scan outgoing emails for masculine imperatives. With 3 keystrokes, I initiated the Sloan sequence, a custom script I had written at Nexus to purge every ideological bottleneck from the firm's infrastructure. As the Tone audit software was wiped from the drives, the server fans throughout the office began to spin down from their frantic, high-pitched whine to a steady, productive hum. The air conditioning, which Clara had supposedly harmonized to follow the biological rhythms of the female staff, was reset to a crisp, logical 68 degrees. The office was literally cooling down, the fever of sociological experimentation breaking in real time as the sanctuary was stripped back down to its brutalist, concrete, and highly profitable skeleton. Clara stood in the center of this dismantling world, her asymmetrical gray suit looking increasingly like a costume from a play that had just been canceled mid-performance, her face a mask of dilated shock that suggested she was watching the laws of physics being repealed. She didn't look at the security guards or the technicians. She turned her gaze toward Sarah and Elena, the 2 women who'd been her primary vantage points, during her year-long crusade to deconstruct the department's silent competence. "Sarah, Elena," Clara shrieked, her voice cracking as it hit the higher frequencies of pure, unadulterated panic. "Are you just going to stand there? Are you going to let him recolonize this space in front of you? This is exactly what the Great Quiet warned us about. He's using his unearned capital to buy back the right to silence you. Speak up. Reclaim your narrative agency." It was a desperate, frantic appeal to the sisterhood she thought she had built, a final attempt to use the jargon of the marginalized to protect her own crumbling hierarchy. But Sarah and Elena didn't move toward her. They didn't even look at her with the solidarity she expected. Instead, Sarah stepped forward, her eyes fixed on me with a look of profound, professional relief. She looked like a prisoner who had just been told the guards were leaving and the gate was unlocked. "Clara, be quiet," Sarah said, and the tone of her voice was something I hadn't heard in a year. It was loud, it was sharp, and it was entirely focused on the reality of the situation. "You spent 12 months telling us that we were victims of Leo's silence. But do you know what I was actually a victim of? I was a victim of your 3-hour huddles. I was a victim of the Arctic corridor crisis that almost ended my career because you wouldn't let me ask for help. I was a victim of having to do my job and your emotional labor every single day." Elena nodded, her arms crossed tightly over her chest as she watched the last of the resonance banners disappear into the elevator. "You didn't give us a voice, Clara," Elena added, her voice trembling not with fear, but with years' worth of repressed technical frustration. "You gave us a burden. You turned our co-workers into ghosts and then told us to be grateful for the extra space. I'm tired of holding space. I just want to write code that doesn't have to be vetted by an empathy filter. Leo isn't colonizing anything. He's just bringing back the people who actually know how to fix the servers." The betrayal was absolute. Clara had built a kingdom to protect the marginalized, only to realize that the people she claimed to protect were the ones who hated her the most for the cage she had built around them. As the 10-minute window drew to a close, I stood up from the boss's chair and walked over to where Clara was still standing, huddled on the last remaining floor cushion, like a shipwrecked survivor on a raft of sociological theory. I didn't feel smug, and I didn't feel the need to gloat. I felt the cold, detached satisfaction of an engineer who had finally removed a persistent bottleneck from a high-flow system. I looked down at her, the charcoal tablet she was still clutching now displaying a critical system disconnection, alert from the very filters I had just deleted. "The time for atmospheric negotiation has ended, Clara," I said, my voice cutting through her remaining delusions with the precision of a laser. "Your termination is not a vantage point adjustment, and it is not a reciprocal deconstruction. It is a standard, merit-based dismissal for a catastrophic operational failure. You were hired to align a culture, but all you did was destroy a capability. You turned a room full of brilliant architects into a collection of bland bots because you were more interested in their vibrational resonance than their 99% uptime." I gestured to the 2 security officers, who stepped into her peripheral vision, their presence a physical punctuation mark to my statement. Sarah and Elena have already indicated their desire to return to a logic-driven meritocracy. The sisterhood you think you're leading doesn't want your protection. They want their partners back. They want to be able to have a loud, messy, technical argument without having to wait for a 5-second deference buffer. I leaned in slightly, my expression returning to the neutral, unblinking stoicism that had once made her so furious. "A year ago, you told me that my silence was a form of violence. Today, my silence is simply the sound of you no longer being part of this company's future. You have 5 minutes to exit the lobby. If you attempt to access the Nexus Global servers from a remote location, my security protocols, which I assure you do not include a validation acknowledgement, will initiate a total digital erasure of your professional footprint." Clara tried to find one last piece of jargon to throw at me, one last deconstructive barb to save her ego, but her mouth only moved in a silent, mechanical twitch. She realized that I had reached a level of power where her words no longer carried any linguistic weight at all. She stood up, her asymmetrical suit crumpled and her confidence shattered, and she walked toward the elevator in the same silence she had tried to impose on us for a year. The doors closed, the resonant sanctuary was officially vacant, and for the first time in 12 months, I turned back to the room and said the only thing that mattered. All right, the filters are down and the buffers are gone. Gary, Tom, Javier, get over here. We've got a year's worth of technical debt to fix, and I want to hear exactly how we're going to do it. Loudly. The weeks that followed the physical and ideological eviction of Clara from the premises of Zenith Global were characterized by a phenomenon that our industry peers began to describe as the Great Restoration. Though within the glass and steel confines of our high-rise headquarters, we simply viewed it as the return of oxygen to a vacuum-sealed room. The office did not merely return to its previous state of high-level boredom. It underwent a profound structural hardening as the men and women of the department, now operating under the banner of the Nexus Zenith merger, discarded the cumbersome armor of atmospheric safety in favor of the lean, unyielding efficiency of the Nexus logic core. I spent my first month as CEO not in the high-walled isolation of the boss's chair, but standing in the trenches of the server room alongside Gary, Tom, and Javier, physically overseeing the dismantling of the last remnants of Clara's sociological architecture. We replaced the resonant sanctuary's floor cushions with high-performance ergonomic workstations designed for 16-hour focus sessions, and we stripped the empathy filters from the central mail servers with a level of surgical aggression that felt, to our technical minds, like the removal of a malignant tumor from a vital organ. The digital equity timers were not just turned off. They were recycled into components for a new, high-speed load balancer that prioritized packet integrity over the linguistic footprint of the sender, a symbolic transformation of a tool of control into a tool of capability. The linguistic alignment, slogans that had once mocked our silent competence, were painted over with flat, industrial gray, and the air conditioning was permanently locked at 68 degrees, a temperature that Clara had claimed was a thermal microaggression, but which my architects recognized as the optimal operating environment for both silicon and high-bandwidth human thought. The bland bots and ghosts, who had been my brothers in arms during the year of the Great Quiet, underwent a rapid, almost supernatural reanimation. Their voices returned, no longer hesitant or filtered through a validation acknowledgement, but loud, sharp, and dripping with the toxic certainty of experts who no longer fear the calibration of a culture representative. We realize that organic collaboration is not a delicate flower that needs to be protected from the friction of disagreement, but a high-performance engine that requires friction to create the traction necessary for a 99% uptime. The communication between the men and women of the department became a messy, overlapping, and intellectually violent symphony of directness, where a technical correction was seen as an act of professional respect rather than a conceptual colonization. We built a world where the only vantage point that carried any weight was the one that could prove its logic in the staging environment, and by the end of the first quarter, the Nexus Zenith merger had achieved a level of profitability and operation stability that made Clara's atmospheric impact reports look like the incoherent ramblings of a failed civilization. The medical supplies that had been lost during the Arctic corridor crisis were replaced by a new, automated delivery system that utilized the very masculine urgency Clara had tried to purge as its primary heuristic. And as the stock price climbed back toward its historic peaks, I realized that the compliance ghost I had become was merely a chrysalis of the titan of industry I had always been destined to lead. The most profound shift, however, was not found in the server logs or the balance sheets, but in the psychological landscape inhabited by Sarah, Elena, and the other women whom Clara had supposedly centered at the cost of the company's survival. Sarah, who had spent a year of atmospheric equity, drowning in the silent, mandated apathy of her male partners, became the fiercest advocate for the new logic-first regime, leading the charge to abolish the last of the vulnerability huddles in favor of 20-minute technical scrums, where the only safety provided was the assurance that no one would be punished for being right. I watched her during a high-stakes meeting regarding the integration of a new South American shipping hub. She didn't wait for a contextual validation statement or a linguistic quota, and she certainly didn't care if she occupied too much space as she tore into Tom's initial routing script with the surgical precision of a master architect. Tom didn't recoil or check his equity journal. He leaned in, argued back with fierce, unfiltered intensity, and together they solved a $3 million bottleneck in the time it would have taken Clara to facilitate a closure huddle. The sisterhood that Clara had tried to engineer through the suppression of the male voice had been replaced by a genuine, unforced brotherhood and sisterhood of the machine, a collective of professionals who realize that true equality is not the absence of power, but the shared right to exercise competence without having to apologize for the vibrational resonance of their logic. Sarah and Elena were no longer vantage points to be protected. They were architects to be respected, and they found far more empowerment in a loud, messy argument with a toxic senior dev than they ever had in the sterile, patronizing sanctuary that Clara had built around this supposed fragility. We realized that by making men ghosts, Clara had simultaneously made women fragile, and by returning the men to their full, unedited technical sovereignty, we had inadvertently freed the women to be the formidable professionals they had always been before the arrival. The office was loud again, filled with the sound of voices overlapping, the laughter of people who actually liked each other, an occasional assertive imperative that signaled the system was back on the rails. We had learned that the most effective way to resist a leader who wants to control your spirit through rules is to become so good at the rules that the rules themselves become the weapon of your liberation. We were no longer following the Zenith equity mandate. We were following the Nexus Prime reality. And the reality was that a company thrives not when its culture is aligned, but when its people are free to be the brilliant, messy, and uncompromising experts the market demands them to be. The oatmeal-colored carpet was eventually replaced with dark, industrial slate, a material that didn't muffle the sound of progress but echoed it, a constant reminder that in the new Zenith, silence was a choice made by the focused, not a mandate imposed by the fearful. The final irony of Clara's crusade reached my desk nearly a year after her eviction in the form of a glossy academic journal titled The Theoretical Vanguard, Post-Corporate Sociolinguistics. I was sitting in the boss's chair, looking out over a city that was currently being fed and fueled by the very distribution maps my team had perfected, when I saw her name on the cover. The lead article was written by Clara, now a senior fellow of atmospheric justice at a prestigious university. It was titled, The Invisible Strike, How the Great Cry of Zenith Global Exposed the Fragility of the Masculine Ego. I spent my lunch hour reading it, not with anger, but with the detached fascination of a biologist studying a creature that had evolved to live entirely within its own hallucinations. In her writing, Clara had framed the total collapse of Zenith's productivity and the subsequent hostile takeover as a strategic ideological success, arguing that by forcing the men into absolute, performative silence, she had achieved a level of purity in the narrative space that had never been seen before in a corporate setting. She claimed that the men's withdrawal was not a failure of her rules, but a desperate, silent protest that proved how much they relied on unearned linguistic dominance to maintain their sense of self. She even described my final proclamation and her eviction as a harmonic closure, framing her firing as a necessary transition into the academic realm, where the work of recalibration could continue without the interference of task-oriented erasers. It was a masterpiece of failing upwards, a way to turn the literal destruction of a $50 million capability into a trophy of theoretical excellence. Clara was still the hero of her story. She was still the Velvet Inquisitor, the woman who had poked the patriarchy and watched it flinch into silence. She was now teaching a new generation of alignment agents how to enter companies and implement equity protocols, using Zenith Global as a case study in how to purge the technical gatekeepers. I looked at her author photo. She was wearing a new asymmetrical linen suit, her glasses even thicker and more architectural than before, and I realized that she would never understand the truth. She would never realize that we hadn't been humbled or awakened by her rules. We had simply been bored by them. She would never understand that her success in academic theory was a direct result of her total irrelevance in the real world of flow and logic. To Clara, the world was a collection of stories to be deconstructed. To us, the world was a machine to be maintained, and the machine didn't care about her story any more than it cared about the vibrational resonance of a failing server. I closed the journal and placed it in the very same recycling bin where I had once placed her Resonance Sanctuary banners, a final act of atmospheric alignment that felt far more satisfying than any vulnerability huddle could have ever been. As the sun began to set behind the brutalist skyscrapers of the business district, casting long, cinematic shadows across my office, I felt the final cold piece of the compliance ghost settle over me, but this time it was different. It was the silence of a sovereign, not a subject. I looked down at the mahogany table, my hand resting on the operational integrity report that showed our uptime at a perfect 99.9%, and I felt a small, genuine smile touch my face. I remembered the equity journal Clara had given me, a book that was currently gathering dust in the back of a drawer in my old cubicle, and I realized that the greatest lesson she had taught me was the power of absolute, unshakable indifference. In a world where people are increasingly desperate to control your tone, your space, and your internal state, the most radical act of rebellion is to simply stop caring if they succeed or fail. By withdrawing our energy and our passion, we had allowed Clara's world to vibrate itself to pieces, proving that an ideology that cannot survive the silence of its subjects is not an ideology at all. It's just a noise. I looked at the executive chair, the boss's chair, and I realized that it was no longer just a piece of furniture or a symbol of hierarchy. It was a vantage point of reality, a place where the only quota was the code and the only buffer was the one that prevented data loss. The department was still loud below me. I could hear Gary shouting about a latency spike and Sarah laughing as she told him his index was embarrassing, and the sound was beautiful. It was a sound of a system that was no longer being aligned by an outside force, but was instead humming with the natural, messy, and high-flow energy of people who were finally, completely, and unapologetically themselves. I stood up and walked toward the window, looking at the city lights flickering on like a million tiny logic gates, and I felt a sense of profound clarity. Clara had tried to destroy my career by turning me into a ghost, but all she had done was teach me how to move through the shadows of the corporate world until I found the throne. I was no longer the man who worked for the machine. I was the man who understood that the machine is the people, and that the only rule that matters is the one that keeps the heart beating. I turned back to my desk, picked up my phone, and dialed Sarah's extension, not to facilitate a resonance check, but to tell her that her new South American routing script was a work of art, and that I was about to interrupt her evening with a task-oriented correction on paragraph 4. It was going to be a loud, productive, and entirely non-compliant night, and I wouldn't have had it any other way. The great quiet was over, but the silence of the architect would remain, a silence of deep focus, of unshakable intent, and a man who finally knew exactly how much space he was supposed to occupy.